Every country has commercial sex, has prostitution. Poorer countries have a larger proportion of the population that is related to prostitution. Using a condom or not is definitely market-driven. Sex workers who allow unsafe sex benefit from that in terms of the income they have.
What does the global industry look like, given the rise of a lot of online platforms?
The internet becomes more and more important to organize prostitution, very unevenly. It allows sex workers to screen and select their clients slightly better. We need more well-developed research.
Do you make sex boring?
Well, apparently I do. Yeah, at cocktail parties, people like to ask and giggle about my research if they heard about it. Well, for the first few minutes, it's maybe not boring, but then it soon becomes, because of course I try to bring in metrics into studying commercial sex. I try to do as good a job as possible, which is not easy. We'll talk about that. And then it easily becomes boring. So yeah, the main answer is, or the very short answer is yes.
Right. And I guess a good place to start off would be, well, leading on from that, is what is the scale of the sex industry across the globe today? Like, how pervasive is it? I'm imagining it varies massively between different regions and geographies. You know, some countries obviously probably allow the industry to occur. In countries it's illegal, and so there's probably like some sort of black market components, things like that. So if you could just give me like an overview of what the kind of scale of the sex industry and what it's like across the globe.
Well, I'll start with the disclaimer, but I'm going to repeat it a number of times throughout the talk. The disclaimer is actually we don't know. We have some ideas, we have bits and pieces of information, which is very suggestive, and we know quite a bit. It's large as compared to the 0 point. Every country has commercial sex, has prostitution, and has it at a decent scale, even where it's illegal and so on and so forth. It's harder to measure it there, so we know less, or the known unknowns are larger. But it's substantial in each place. One thing that helps in terms of the money that goes around is to take a look at those countries that report illegal sectors. Well, in theory, all countries should include illegal sectors in their national accounts. So in theory, they all have estimates of prostitution, smuggling, and illegal drugs, the added value of that. So if we just take that as a point of comparison, the countries where you can openly find data, you find that prostitution is substantial, but a lot smaller than, for instance, illegal drugs in most countries. There may be a bit of a methods effect, but I think that's more or less the wiggle room we have. So yes, there's quite a few people involved in it. There's some suggestive evidence, not very foundational, but some good evidence that seems to indicate that poorer countries have a larger proportion of the population and a larger sector that is related to prostitution. But it goes as far as that. So very detailed information in this country X and in that country Y is very hard to get by.
And is the reason for some of that difference just, I would imagine, data gathering between different countries is going to be very different. Estimating, I imagine in places like the Netherlands, for example, where it's there is legalization, it's probably more of a trackable industry. You can look at maybe tax revenues, you can look at sort of participants, labor force participation, all that kind of stuff. Whereas in other countries where it's illegal, you have to use your kind of best estimates and things like that a lot of time. Is that kind of the reason why we don't really know the sort of grand scale of it across the globe to that degree?
Well, that's one reason, but there's multiple others. So let me start with a paradox. We looked into the estimates of the labor supply, so the number of people who work as sex workers or something that is related to that. And basically, the shortest version of the conclusion is the best estimates are in low and middle income countries, probably related to the AIDS epidemic, where a lot of money and good research has flown into estimating the size of the sex worker population, but mainly in low income countries. So there's a few of them around in richer countries, but not enough to really come with conclusions like if it's forbidden, the sector is that much smaller or anything like that. There's some indications, but not as strong as that. That's one thing. So the legal status, of course, has a double problem. Probably, if you make prostitution illegal, the size of the market becomes smaller. It stands to reason. It's in line with economic theory. It's in line with most people's intuition, and it seems to happen, but not radically. So there's a reduction of the size of the market. So probably it's smaller. The problem with the estimates is that probably it's also much harder to estimate. So you undercount much more in countries where prostitution is illegal or very much more frowned upon. So there's a lot of problems, regardless of whether you count the number of people involved, clients, sex workers, or you count the money going around or the added value involved. Basically, it becomes harder if it's illegal, but there's some good indications that indeed the sector is smaller too.
Right. And for where you have got hidden populations that you're trying to estimate, what are the kind of methodologies that you're using, or that I guess the scientific literature tries to use to try and estimate those populations? You know, what do you got? What are we and what is the scientific industry using to try and pull these estimates? You mentioned there that in some of these developing countries, they have slightly better estimates because they were trying to put a lot of money potentially into establishing it to try and fight HIV or AIDS or something. So it
Mm-hmm.
sounds as though that there are some methodologies for estimating that are better than others. If you can maybe gather some data or something on those things.
Um, Let me say something about disciplines first. The funny thing is the discipline that is probably pretty advanced in, not the only one, but pretty advanced in estimating hard to estimate stuff. That's economics or econometrics, or those two together. They're not very involved in that kind of exercise. So if you look at the people who do top notch, but overall also, but certainly the top notch estimations, I think there's a big concentrations in epidemiology, biostatistics, that kind of discipline. So related to healthcare, not criminologists, not economists, not even sociologists. Funny enough. What are the good techniques that come around? Well, there's a number of them, but I think the real top estimation strategies often relate to something called capture recapture. It has different names, mark recapture, some other names too. What you basically try to do is you try to find those people you cannot count by doing in the standard model two captures of a population. So it comes from biology, hence the awkward name of capture. You try to identify a number of sex workers. And a second time, you try to identify a number of sex workers again, trying to find back with some mark or something else those who have been identified twice. And with the overlap, you can make a reasonable estimate of the population. So that's the technique that is used most often. We have tried, but it's still very experimental, I must admit. We have tried to adopt that technique in internet data, which is, of course, much easier to come by. And it looks like this is going to work in the future if some more people would be involved in that. This would allow to estimate the population in certainly in high income countries much easier because crawling the internet, of course, goes much faster than going into the field, identifying sex workers, identifying them again. It also has less ethical problems than the classical technique.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, and that kind of actually relates back to the book actually, because one of the things I picked up when reading it is that actually, to your point, a lot of the research into the sex industry doesn't actually necessarily come from economists. It does come from health scientists for a long time, or sort of other disciplines. So I guess that's a good segue really into your feelings and your purpose and your objectives in terms of writing the book. Could you maybe outline what you were trying to achieve in putting the book together and sort of pulling all the data that you did in the way that you
Okay,
wrote it?
I'll start with feelings, which is a bit awkward or
Okay.
uncomfortable for academics, but I'll try that one first. A number of years ago, I was part of a international network. We had some funding. I think something like 20 countries, mainly academics that were studying sex work and prostitution in Europe and a few countries around it, but mostly Europe. And I think we were like 80 people, something around that. And I was virtually the only one who was doing quantitative analysis or trying to do quantitative analysis of the commercial sexual sector. And these people were not, well, they knew their business, they knew what it was about. They did, some of them did very good research or decent and pretty good research. That wasn't the point, but there was a huge gap in terms of quantitative techniques and what was happening there. So the basic idea of the book was there's plenty of people who know a lot about prostitution, but nothing about the quantitative techniques. There's plenty of people who are good in the credibility revolution, know everything about causal inference and anything. But of course, usually they're not very involved in markets for sex. And I try to explain those two elements, markets for sex on the one hand, and credibility revolution or metrics or whatever you want to call it. On the other hand, try to bring them a bit together, explain them to these two audiences. So in terms of feelings, was my frustration that some good research is happening, but it's hard to come by for the people who are in the field doing outreach or doing research with anthropological insights and techniques and all that. And the other way around, of course. Um, Markets for sex are markets too, and it's something that seems to be pushed under the ground. Well, it is often underground, but pushed under the ground also in mainstream academia. That was the basic feeling why I started writing the book, what I tried to communicate.
Hmm. And in terms of the industry itself, I was thinking, to your point, I think earlier when you said, well, it's hard to sort of grasp sort of the kind of the scale of the sex industry. I mean, when I was doing some research, I was kind of pulling different figures from different places about, the number of people that work in the sex industry, what kind of GDP and stuff that is related to these things. Could you perhaps speak to some of that data, potentially in regards to how intertwined the sex industry is with local economies and potentially in Europe or the UK or elsewhere, and how it affects things like labor economics and whether potentially traditional aspects of labor economics, things like minimum wage rates and all this kind of stuff, whether they do apply to prostitution or whether they kind of fall into their own bracket. Do they act in the same ways?
Okay. The short answer again is yes, it's economics. Basically, what people do at the supply side who work in the sex industry, well, they try to gain an income. There's a huge, pretty moralized debate about whether you can call people involved in prostitution, selling sex, whether you can call them workers. But from an economic standpoint, it's a no-brainer. People do the activity in order to gain an income. Whether they identify with it, see it as a political stance or anything, is not very material for most economists or labor sociologists for that matter. So, from that perspective, it's an income generating activity, period, most of it. So, yeah, labor economics, particularly, and economics in general, does apply to it. Although, in a few respects, it's a different market. It's mainly underground. There's huge stigma involved with the sector. So, there's a number of reasons why it's a market somehow unlike others. But on the other hand, and let me start with that, it's definitely a market and it functions like a market. I think one of the areas where the most impressive progress has been made in terms of mainstream economics in the prostitution wage setting is compensating wage differentials. So if you look into the literature of compensating wage differentials, the basic idea comes from Adam Smith. So it's something like 250 years old. um, it has been developed in the 1970s, if I'm not wrong, by Chauvin Rosen, at least formalized. So the theory is pretty old, either a few centuries or a few decades. empirical support for the compensating wage differential was much scarcer. So it was very hard to prove that people, if there's something unattractive about the job, they demand higher wages in order to be willing to do the job. Probably because lots of labor markets are very regulated, there's minimum wages and all that. Starting at the very early 2000s, even I think around 2000, Rao, a World Bank economist, has for the first time shown that in prostitution, for instance, especially applied to using a condom or not in an intercourse, is definitely market driven. So there's an incentive where sex workers who allow unsafe sex without a condom receive or benefit from that in terms of the income they have. So you have something of a trade off between taking risks of an STD or worse, and on the other hand, earning a higher income. And certainly in low income countries, this may be the difference between being hungry or not, or going hungry or not. So it seemed to work. I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, no, exactly. I think because I've got a quote here from the book that you included, and that's a key reason why sex workers can earn so much is that sex work has to compensate for the benefits, non-monetary and monetary, that come with it essentially.
Yeah.
And so it's interesting so that even down to like the level of whether to use a condom or not use a condom, the wage rate and the level of income that they're receiving is literally proportionate to how much risk they are taking in these things, even to
Yeah.
that kind of level, right? So it seems actually quite detailed almost and granular in terms of what we actually know about it.
Yeah, indeed. So the small picture or the very fine grained picture is, for instance, the research on the condom use. Probably there's other aspects too of adverse working conditions, as they are called, in or risky working conditions. But the big picture is that probably compensating wage differentials are very much at work. Also, the evidence is much harder to get by, but at a level of entrance into sex work, you lose a lot of opportunities. There's the stigma. It's a risky job overall. There's lots of differences within the job, but it's a risky job overall. And what you see is indeed strong indications that the wage you get from being a sex worker is substantially higher than the wage that most of the people that are involved could get in the mainstream labor market.
Right, and I think that was another area I picked up on. I think there seemed to be at least some evidence, at least in some scenarios, where if the economic activity or the kind of industry of a particular area declines over a period, then there is a kind of a subsequent rise in the amount of people that are engaging in sex work. I think you reference in the book that there's a period in England, basically, I think it was
Yeah,
Grant and Goering. I think that were sort of looking at Lancashire and Cheshire counties over quite like a large time span. I think they found like an increase of about 21% in the affected areas due to that kind of shock. So it does also seem to be the market also seem to be linked to the conditions of the wider economy at the centre of time. So at the same as well.
yeah. Well, there's some echoes of the Becker economics of crime logic, but then applied not to something criminal. Well, it may be, but not always. But something shameful, or at least frowned upon by good society. And the paper of Goering is like pretty impressive in that respect. It's economic history. He looks at a crisis in the textile industries in the 19th century and definitely sees a sharp increase in the number of brothels in those areas that are most affected by the crisis. Even not taking into account that probably demand for sex has decreased because also the men had lower wages and lost a lot of standard of living. But even then, supply increased a lot, which suggests something very similar to the Becker frame. Like you compare, on the one hand, the possibilities of earning an income in the mainstream labor market, and on the other hand, the possibilities of earning an income, in this case in sex work, in the case of Becker in crime.
Yeah, that is interesting actually, because in those periods you would also think that, yeah, to your point, men's wages are also going down. So you would think essentially there was less demand for these things, but it doesn't
Yeah,
necessarily seem to manifest it like that. I guess you could point it to other kind of products or goods or services, things like, I know, alcohol, for example. You'd expect that to go down in times of recession, but frequently it's kind of consumption and demand tends to go up because I guess people are looking for sort of an additional degree of escapism. I guess maybe there's a parallel with that with the prostitution
Yeah,
industry.
and if I have to make a guess, probably the prices in prostitution went down too, because it's an informal sector, so it's very flexible. Like most informal sectors in a time of crisis, you see people going into it. That's another parallel of economic research that seems to be very close to Goering's conclusions. Informal economies tend to be countercyclical, so they grow a bit, but usually the wages drop too, if we in times of crisis. So it's pretty similar to that.
Hmm. And because and I think I was quite surprised actually when reading the book because it seems as though it almost acts a lot more similarly to other labours and other industries than perhaps I would have necessarily thought, whether that be through the nature of it or potentially the illegal nature of it in some jurisdictions and regions anyway. Because a general thing where they say about wage rate and how much you're compensated for work, a component of it is brand reputation essentially. So for example, you might earn slightly more as a dustbin man for potentially than working at a retail shop because the wage has to compensate you for that kind of loss in a kind of reputational damage to some degree. Obviously, there's a big constellation of factors there in terms of how hard is it to do, labor supply, all that kind of stuff. But it was interesting when I was just reading that there were so many ties to sort of so many other sort of industries that might be similar in terms of like a brand reputation component of it. And you could probably even look back to sort of areas of class, maybe in England or maybe even in India with caste, where people may even be sort of appropriately remunerated depending on certain stations and losses and brand reputation.
Yeah. So what you can expect that's so Marina della Giusta, she's a British economist, and I think the most robust theoretical frame has been developed by her, and it all turns around to reputational loss or the potential for reputational loss. This probably is also a reason why people with who are better known, who are higher skilled, all those things have a higher opportunity cost to enter into sex work because they have a higher potential of losing reputation. If you're from a very low caste or class in a very class or caste sensitive society, of course, your potential for reputation loss is smaller. So, historically speaking, but maybe even in contemporary societies, this may play a role why poor people, not just the economic part, but also the status part, why they are more likely to be involved in sex work.
Hmm. And I might be skipping forward a little bit here, but in an age where I would say that we have a lot more online mechanisms for distribution, things like OnlyFans and other, obviously they're not prostitution sites, but just kind of general sex industry related mechanisms. I wonder actually in relation to that, if over time, as a global society or in local jurisdictions, there is less of a brand reputational damage associated with it because of like culture changes. Could we potentially see that wage rates drop for people's in the sex industry because there isn't necessarily the reputational damage associated with the work that they do?
Well, let me first make the remark as far as we have some anecdotal and some systematic evidence, the decrease of the stigma is very unevenly distributed through society. So probably there's an age effect. Older people still look down on it more than younger people. There's also a gender difference, pretty marked, and so on and so forth. But given the economic theory and given the support that exists today, I think that indeed, if stigma for sex work go down, and it seems to go down with younger people or among younger people, you would expect prices to go down to more supply, prices going down, and all that.
Hmm. Yeah, interesting. And what does the global industry look like given the rise of a lot of online platforms? Again, I mentioned OnlyFans as an example there in terms of kind of the porn industry. But of course, like the introduction of the internet, the introduction of more online sites and for, on whether that be on the dark web or just legally for this type of work in industry. how have they affected the industry itself in terms of things like safety, pricing, regulation, etc.?
Mhm. Well, again, the very short answer is pretty radically. Yeah? One of the probably most important economists who's done quite a few empirical studies on prostitution is Scott Cunningham, and he's termed it prostitution 2.0, which may not be very original, but at least the point is clear. Beginning in the early 21st century, I think, probably that's the best dating, you see that the internet becomes more and more important to organize prostitution very unevenly. So street prostitution remains mainly driven by direct contact. A sex worker steps into a car, a client asks how much, which services, and so on and so forth. So it's still the barter in person and all that. But we see, as far as we have data, that most of these sectors decline in favor of sectors that are internet driven. So at least the matching and the making the agreements, the advertisements too, are typically done through the internet. The impact of that overall, as far as we have evidence, seems to be that the job becomes safer. One of the probable mechanisms is that it allows sex workers to screen and select their clients slightly better. So they don't have to hop into a car of a client of whom they know nothing. They can select a bit more. If they are successful, they can stick to fewer fixed clients who they know better, which of course reduces the risks both of the typical risks of STDs, but also of violence to the extent that this is tied to the intimacy of knowing someone well, and the personality of a person. And it seems to be like that. The economist I cited, Scott Cunningham, he has this impressive paper. It's one of the most impressive ones I know in the world because it's both, it's elegant, it's very well designed econometrically, so the identification strategy is nice, and it shows, or at least it makes very credible, that the rollout of one very popular platform of the internet where sex workers can advertise has a marked impact on murder or homicide on women in regions where the internet platform in the US was rolled out, which of course is pretty impressive. That the technology can have this very substantial impact on the sex industry. He also shows in the margin that there's probably a substantial but not that large increase of the market, so it grows slightly. But at the same time, it reduces the number of murders of women. Couldn't identify that these women were working in the sex industry, but it's the most logical explanation in terms of mechanism that real predators, very violent people, are less attracted or have a less easy job to find women that they can easily murder because sex work became more safe.
No, that is interesting because I'll be honest. Like, I think my preconception going into the conversation would have been that the prevalence of online platforms, that the growth of the internet would have perhaps led to kind of a lot of maybe detrimental outcomes in terms of health, safety, regulation, and for the sex industry. So it's quite interesting to hear you say that actually in a lot of instances it's actually led to kind of a lot safer conditions. I'm
Yeah,
wondering
yeah.
to be a little bit I don't know, just sort of pointed on it. Is that likely to be a outcomes within a very particular context, as opposed to others? And I'm trying to think about sort of what are the potential downsides here and whether they are as pervasive.
Well, there's a few potential downsides. I often talk to people in policy, police services, or whatever. And these people see it as a mixed bag. On the one hand, they are not contradicting, even intuitively, what Scott Cunningham came with in terms of his research, but they also see that the monitoring by government, who don't always have a good name in protecting sex workers, but anyway, the monitoring by governments, of course, is reduced because you see less of the sector. It typically removes from red light areas, removes from street prostitution towards private apartments and so on. So the whole control by governments is reduced to the extent that, and I explicitly say to the extent that governments protect sex workers, this protection may be hampered a bit by that. So that may be a downside that is often cited by people, practitioners, but that are typically on the government side of regulating and controlling prostitution. I'm not sure, but it might be that they have a point. I'm not sure that offsets some part of the potential protection with the information that certainly in lower middle income countries, but also in some high income countries, the police is mainly engaged in harassing sex workers more than protecting them. And certainly in places where it's illegal and where also selling sex is criminalized. You typically see that most sex workers say that they get fairly little protection from the police. So in that case, it wouldn't make a big difference from that perspective. The second potential downside, of course, and it depends a bit on your personal values. I cannot judge that or decide about that. The second potential downside is that the market grows from it. And so if it becomes easier to enter the market, amongst others, because the internet allows you maybe to remain anonymous, to go to another place and sell sex there so that your peers don't know what you're doing and all that. It might be that if the market grows, and it seems to look like that, that of course that is a certain downside also from certain perspectives. Even with that growth, it seems to be that safety goes up.
Hmm. Interesting. And then actually, I suppose to just focus in on then on the legality and the legislative side, what do we see in terms of difference in I guess the same metrics to some regard in regards to economic indicators, but also health, safety, protections, and
Yeah.
labor rights between countries or jurisdictions that either legalize it or don't legalize it or have some sort of hybrid model in between? What are those kind of the key differences where those legislative differences occur?
Okay, before I go into that literature, two disclaimers. One, context matters. So it's very hard to generalize to all the places where it's legal or illegal. Second, details matter. And very often we gloss over that. Oh, we have seen that X causes Y, and therefore that's what it does always. But with those disclaimers in mind, it looks like criminalization mainly makes the market smaller. There's a rebound effect. In the best studies, we see that it becomes, in the beginning, there's a shock, it becomes a lot smaller, and there's a certain rebound effect. But for those few studies we have where it's followed up for a bit longer, the rebound effect still means a reduction of the market. So that's as far as we can be clear. It seems to be the case. And pretty symmetrically, if you decriminalize, the market seems to grow somehow. It's nicely in line with what you would expect theoretically, and that seems to be one thing. Second is those sex workers remaining in a criminalized context have worse working conditions. So there's more violence. There's definitely more unsafe sex. So less condom use and all that. One study, probably the most robust one, has been done in a few districts in Indonesia, the Malang study. And while the researchers, these were health economists, were doing fieldwork in 3 districts, one district decided to criminalize prostitution, close the legalized brothels. And they followed up on that. Probably in the beginning, they were pretty depressed, like there goes our study. But then they saw the whole idea of this is just a natural experiment nobody could have invented. And they followed up on it. What they saw, they even followed up on those ex-sex workers who stopped working, because one of the strange things was you had a shock of a reduction of the supply of sex work. The remaining sex work was mainly filled in by new sex workers, so probably people with a different profile. And most of the former sex workers stopped, lost a lot of their standard of living, the scholarization level of their children reduced, and all that. So the impact in terms of their standard of living was pretty substantial. The risk of sex workers being infected with STDs increased substantially, but really a lot, amongst others, because the police really started hunting after condom use and people having a few condoms with them. because they probably were pimps or sex workers themselves, which made the price of condoms much higher and they were hardly used anymore. That impact was not just on the sex worker population, it was also on the general population, nicely in line with what you would expect, more with men, less with women in the mainstream population. But even there, it was a marked increase. So the impact was pretty negative. Although, of course, some people who advocate for criminalization would say, yes, but the market's still reduced. We see, as far as there are studies in terms of decriminalization, we see something symmetrical, well, something invert. So usually it becomes safer. Once again, there's one study by Cunningham, a localized in the United States, a local decriminalization of brothels, which increased the sector substantially, decreased potential rape in the general population. So there's some suggestions there that it may be that if sex work or prostitution services become less achievable for clients, it may lead, for a number of reasons, to more sexual abuse and maybe even more violence in society overall. This is also substantiated in a macroeconomic paper by Gao and Petrova, coming with the same conclusion. Criminalization increases rape rates, at least registered rape rates, substantially. So overall, it seems to be that there's not a consensus, not by far, but that the direction of where the effects of criminalization and decriminalization go seems to become somehow clear, based on only a limited number of studies, of course.
Right. Okay. Interesting. And when you were putting the book together, was there something that like surprised you that maybe you hadn't maybe anticipated before pulling all the research together and writing the book? Was there something about the industry itself that maybe surprised you?
Um, Well, not. I've been walking around in this world and publishing and researching quite a bit for something like a decade and a half. So it was more reaping the benefits of reading all this stuff all the time. So it wasn't that much new that I saw. It was rather the organizing. I must admit that 1 decade and a half ago, I was pretty agnostic about effects of policies or anything. And I'm well, it's a long time, a decade and a half, in at least in a human life. But if I see in which direction the research goes, there seems to be something of not a consensus, but at least some profiles with, if you just stick to rigid studies of what we see happening, not everything, but some elements, the ones we have been discussing, seems to point in some more or less robust evidence. And that's something that surprised me positively because I keep on nagging that we don't have enough research. I still believe that there's a far scarcity of enough contexts where we do this kind of research and all that. So meta-analysis or anything are definitely out of bounds still. But it goes in the right direction. So that may have surprised me. I ended the book with more optimism about at least the research part of doing good research to give good foundations to potential policies than before.
Hmm. And actually, on that point you mentioned there about policy implications, obviously the whole uh, policy section, politics side of the sex industry is incredibly sort of turbulent and maybe the turbulence. I guess is an interesting word to put in there. But is there, I wonder, a piece of policy advice that you would perhaps suggest, taking out sort of the moral connotations of it, of where you think something could be introduced that would basically maybe not change like the material aspects of it, but would either help the economic side of it or maybe improve safety conditions and things like that?
Yeah. My first, of course, it's a bit self-serving, but I think in this case it's with good reason. We need more research, but not just blank more research. We need more well-developed research. And the big issue at the very beginning of good research is having good data. So my absolute priority would be in, and it's a short-term objective you can reach. Please invest in collecting good data. Whether you do it as a government, a statistical agency, and making those data available to good researchers, I think that would be the ideal situation where people are not sitting on their data, but they are made available to people who are able to do good stuff with them, or whether you fund other people doing the research, that's fine too. But I think that would be a secondary idea. But I think that's the first starting. The second one is even, of course, the whole value debate. It's very hard as a researcher to say what people have to think. So I'm okay with that. That some people say prostitution in and of itself is evil. I cannot say you cannot think that. And if people think that, that's fine, but it comes with a cost if you develop policies that are in line with that. And so if you say we're going to criminalize it because it's evil, it probably comes with a cost in terms of the safety of people you think are evil, but are still nevertheless people. Um, Even if you do that, I think you can do worse or better. We just discussed the Indonesian study where police officers, and I've heard similar stories in the United States and everything, where police officers started hunting people who had more than one or two condoms in their pocket because they are probably pimps or sex workers themselves. If you do that, the harm is probably much larger than if you just start criminalizing and doing other things to capture the people you think are doing it wrong. Looking at, even if you have a criminalizing policy, even then the way you deter people of being involved in prostitution may make a big difference. I think that would be the main message, regardless of what your basic value attitude is and the ensuing policy. You can still do worse or better within that range.
Yeah, no, I think that's completely fair. And I guess as well, if you had to summarize like one big misconception that you think the general public, or maybe even the economics literature has in regards to how sex markets operate or prostitution works, what would you say that would be?
Well, not among economists. They're not surprised if I say that. But the basic rules still work mostly, I think, would be the general message. And most people think that because it's frowned upon or because it's disliked, that basic economic rules or laws that have been well established, or at least established in a qualified way, they still apply to this sector, and sometimes even more than others. Compensating wage differentials. I'm repeating myself, but has been empirically proven much more efficiently in prostitution markets than in others. There's a long explanation for that. So, because the market is informal, it probably functions more like a free market than many others.
Yeah, interesting. And I guess to just help us like round out the discussion, actually, you mentioned there that one of the big policy things that you would like to potentially see that could just help with the general industry and potential outcomes would be just to have better research and have more research, particularly on specific contexts and geographies. So I guess to kind of round out our conversation, is there a specific area of economic research in regards to the sex industry that you think needs addressing and where more research needs to come in?
Well, of course, the low hanging fruit in terms of ideas is policy impact. Economists have become very good in studying policies and evaluate empirically policies. They have never been shy in saying what kind of policies are needed, but I think they have been humbled by the more empirical turn, studying policies and looking at the effects. So I would suggest that that is the first area, but more fine grained than just the basic discussion about criminalizing or decriminalizing. Which kind of policies have which kind of effects at a very fine grade level for sex workers, for clients, for society overall? I would suggest that that is the first area that is pretty important in a from a practical and quality of life perspective.
Got you. Steph, this has been like a really, really interesting conversation. I really appreciate you taking the time. I guess is there anything that you would leave the listeners with, like maybe some, if people wanted to go and look into the general literature a little bit more? Are there pieces of literature or books or authors that you could potentially recommend to people to go and have a look at?
Well, from an economic perspective, or which one? Because
I guess an economic perspective, but then if you have
yeah,
some recommendations in regards to just like the general industry as well, I think that could also be quite value adding.
yeah. Okay. From an economic perspective, I definitely think that Scott Cunningham's handbook of the economics of prostitution is still, it's a bit older, not very old, but is still great to read. A broader, nice introduction from an more general sexuality perspective on numbers is the British statistician Spiegelhalter. Um, Little book, Sex by Numbers. It's no coincidence that my book sounds the same. I'm sorry, colleague. And finally, if you're interested in historical stuff, there's a very good overview work, because there's been written a lot in historical perspectives by Magali Rodriguez Garcia and two co-authors, but I forgot their names. It's called Sex in the City, and it's a real world tour of interesting case studies of the history of prostitution throughout a number of countries.
Awesome. No, I get. So I think those are really interesting things for us to go and have a look at. I think I'll do myself actually. Steph, thank you. This has been great. I really appreciate taking the time.